I used to think dreams were fragile things, like glass, meant to be handled gently and treasured. But I know better now. Dreams are stubborn, they're seeds buried deep, and even when someone digs up the garden, stomps the soil flat, burns it to ash, sometimes something still grows. But back then, I didn't know that. I was 19 the first time someone told me my dreams were too big for a girl like you. The words came from my mother, though she didn't mean them to hurt. She was standing at the kitchen sink, peeling potatoes, the steam from the pot fogging the window. She said it like a fact, the same way you'd mention rain in the forecast. "You'll just get disappointed," she warned. "Best to keep your head where your hands can reach." I didn't argue. But in my head, I was already in a different life, one where I studied architecture, traveled to cities whose names I could barely pronounce, designed buildings that would stand for generations. That life never came. By 22, I was married to Daniel. He wasn't the reason my dreams shrank, not at first. He had an easy smile, a kind laugh, and the kind of attention that makes you feel lit up from the inside. In those early months, I told him about my plans. He nodded along, kissed my hair, told me I was something special. Then the slow erosion began. It started with the apartment. I wanted the one near the university, close to where I could take evening classes. He said it was too noisy, too expensive. We moved into a quieter building across town, 30 minutes further from campus. "It's temporary," he promised. The second cut came when I got the job at the design firm. I'd only been there 3 weeks when Daniel suggested we try for a baby now while we're young. I told him I wanted to work first to prove myself. He smiled, took my hand, and said, "We have our whole lives for that. Right now, we have a family to think about." It was framed as love, as care, but in the end, I left the firm. The years blurred, one child, then another, my days filled with laundry, grocery lists, school runs. Architecture books gathered dust on the shelf. Daniel's career took off. Promotions, conferences, a bigger house. People said I was lucky. I smiled and agreed. But luck doesn't feel like standing in a kitchen at midnight, staring at your reflection in the dark window, wondering when you stopped being a person and became only a function. Daniel didn't shout. He didn't have to. He decided things, and the world bent around those decisions. When I mentioned taking a part-time drafting course at the community college, he said, "That's cute, but you've already got enough on your plate." When I suggested we save for me to visit Paris, the city I'd dreamed of since I was a girl, he laughed. "Why? We can see pictures online for free." Each time the dream shrank a little smaller. I stopped bringing ideas to him at all. It wasn't worth watching them die in his hands. Then came the day he took the last piece I thought was mine. It was a Tuesday afternoon, nothing special. I was in the backyard, sketching in a notebook while the laundry dried on the line. I'd been drawing a building I'd imagined for years, a curved glass library open to the sea. I'd added tiny balconies, stairs that spiraled like seashells. For the first time in months, I felt that old warmth, the hum of possibility. Daniel came out, saw the notebook, and asked, "What's this?" I told him. I was smiling, proud in a small, private way. He looked at it for a moment, then shook his head. You waste so much time on these. You'll never build anything. Why pretend? Before I could answer, he took the pencil from my hand, flipped the page, and started writing a grocery list over the faint lines of my drawing. It wasn't just paper he ruined that day. Something in me cracked, not loudly, not enough for him to notice, but deep. A hairline fracture that would widen with time. That night, after he fell asleep, I found myself staring at the sketchbook. I could still see the ghost of the library beneath his neat block letters: milk, eggs, bread. I closed it and slid it under the bed. And in the hollow space where my dream had been, something new took root, something quieter, sharper. If I couldn't grow my dreams in the open, I would grow them where he couldn't see. It began with scraps. Literally, I'd collect the backs of old receipts, torn bits of packaging, any piece of paper big enough to hold a quick drawing. I kept them hidden in the hollow of an old sewing machine cabinet my grandmother had given me. Daniel never looked there. He thought the machine was broken. Every morning, once he and the children were gone, I'd take out those scraps and draw. Buildings, gardens, whole cityscapes. Not for anyone else, just for me. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And one winter afternoon, years later, those secret sketches would become the weapon I never knew I was building. For years, my hidden garden of dreams grew in the dark. I'd plant a few seeds each day, a line of roof tiles here, the curve of a window there, and then I'd tuck them away before anyone could trample them. I never thought anyone would see them. That was the point. But one April afternoon, the lock on the sewing cabinet stuck. I'd been careless, left a corner of paper jutting out. It was the plumber who found it. He was there to fix a leak under the kitchen sink, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with oil-stained hands. I'd gone to the living room to get the phone when I heard the sound of the cabinet creak open. By the time I came back, he was standing there, one of my drawings in his hand. "This yours?" he asked. For a moment, I felt like a child caught with stolen candy. I nodded. He studied it. The glass library I'd drawn a dozen times, the one Daniel had tried to erase. "This is good, real good. You do this for work?" I laughed, sharp and quick, before I could stop myself. "No, just for me." He tilted his head, then tucked the paper back where he found it. "You ought to do something with that." Shame to waste it. The words were nothing special, but they lit a small fire in me. Someone, a stranger no less, had looked at my work and seen worth. I thought about that all evening while Daniel sat across from me at dinner, talking about quarterly earnings and a new golf course his boss was joining. He didn't notice I barely spoke. He rarely did. The next morning, I took out the drawing again. I smoothed the edges where the plumber's fingers had creased it, and I realized I wanted more. Not just more drawings, more witnesses. That's when I started copying them, Not the originals, just quick sketches in a plain spiral notebook I bought for grocery planning. I carried it in my purse, tucked behind the real list. That way, if I ever had to show something, I could. And if I had to lose it, my garden in the cabinet would still be safe. At first, I only showed them to people far outside my circle. The cashier at the art store, a woman I met on the bus who was knitting the most intricate scarf I'd ever seen. Little experiments. Each time I braced for dismissal. Each time I got something else. A smile, a question, a flicker of genuine interest. It was intoxicating in its own quiet way. But secrecy is a muscle. Once you've strengthened it, you start using it everywhere. When Daniel asked how I spent my afternoons, I told him I'd been organizing closets or reading. Both were true, just not the whole truth. I never lied outright. I just left the most important parts in the shadows. And that, I learned, is its own kind of power. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. It was late summer, humid and heavy. I was at the park, sitting on a bench under the big elm tree, sketching the outline of an old stone building across the street. A woman sat down beside me, balancing a paper cup of coffee in a briefcase. She had short silver hair, round glasses, and the kind of watch that says you value both time and quality. After a few minutes, she leaned over. Mind if I look? I almost said no. But something in her manner, open, without expectation, made me turn the page toward her. She studied it for a long moment, then said, "Do you sell these?" I shook my head. "Would you like to?" I laughed softly. "They're not professional, just something I do for myself." She smiled. "I'm an editor for a small design magazine. We publish architectural concepts, sometimes from students, sometimes from independent designers. You have an eye. If you ever want to share your work, here's my card." She slid a plain white rectangle onto the bench between us. I didn't touch it right away. I just stared at her name. Helen Park, Senior Editor, Foundations Quarterly. Daniel's voice echoed in my head. "You'll never build anything. Why pretend?" But Helen's voice was louder in that moment. "You have an eye." She left before I could decide whether to thank her or brush it off. I sat there until my coffee went cold, the card still lying between us. When I finally picked it up, it felt heavier than its size should allow. That night, I didn't hide the card in the cabinet. I slipped it inside the notebook I carried in my purse. Because this wasn't just another seed, this was a door. And I knew enough about Daniel to know I'd have to step through it in secret. Over the next week, I began preparing in ways that would look invisible from the outside. I redrew some of my best sketches onto fresh paper. I used the local library's scanner to make clean copies, careful to do it when the attendant was on break so no one could casually glance at my work. Every click of the scanner felt like a hammer hitting the walls of the life I'd been sealed into. By Friday, I had a slim manila envelope full of designs. I walked 3 blocks out of my way to mail it so Daniel wouldn't see the return address on the post box near our house. Then I waited. 2 weeks later, I got the letter. It arrived in a plain envelope. No return logo. The kind that could pass for junk mail if you weren't paying attention. Inside was a single sheet of paper with Helen's neat signature at the bottom. She wanted to feature 2 of my designs in their upcoming issue. They wouldn't be credited with my full name, just initials, if I preferred. They couldn't pay much, but they'd send me 2 contributor copies. I read it 3 times before it sank in. Someone wanted my work. Not to humor me, not to pat me on the head, but to publish it. I sat down at the kitchen table and laughed, quietly, but from somewhere deep. The sound startled me. It had been a long time since I'd heard myself laugh like that. That night, while Daniel was watching television, I wrote back to Helen. I told her I'd be honored. I signed only with my initials, ML. It was the safest choice, the quietest way forward. But deep down, I knew the quiet wouldn't last forever. Because when those magazines arrived in the mail, I was going to hold proof in my hands. Proof that my dreams weren't dead. And proof, I suspected, was the one thing Daniel would never forgive. The magazines arrived on a Tuesday morning in a plain cardboard envelope. The postman left it wedged between the storm door and the frame. I recognized Helen's return address immediately, though it was tucked small into the corner, easy to miss. Daniel was at work. The children were at school. I stood in the hallway, envelope in hand, my pulse in my ears. Inside, 2 glossy issues slid free, cool and heavy. I flipped through the first until I found them, my designs, printed on crisp white pages, my initials in neat black type beneath. The library, its curved glass front catching imagined sunlight. The narrow garden walkway lined with stone archways. Seeing them, there was like finding a mirror that showed a version of me I thought had been erased. I traced my fingers over the paper. Proof. I hid 1 copy in the sewing cabinet under the deepest layer of old fabric scraps. The other I tucked inside a stack of cookbooks in the kitchen, the one place Daniel never bothered to look. For the rest of the day, I felt lighter, not happy exactly, but expanded, as though my skin had been too tight for years and was finally loosening. But lightness, I've learned, is dangerous when you live with someone like Daniel. They feel it before they see it. That evening, he came home, set his briefcase on the counter, and just looked at me for a moment. "You're in a good mood," he said. I shrugged. It was a good day. Why? I turned back to the stove. The weather. It was a believable enough lie. Spring had finally broken the long winter. Still, I could feel his eyes on me while I stirred the soup. Watching, weighing, for the next few days, I was careful. I didn't linger with the magazine. I didn't draw in the open. I told myself I could keep this separate. My garden, his world. But separation is a fantasy. Eventually, the edges touch. It happened on a Saturday. Daniel had gone to the garage to look for a wrench, and I was in the kitchen with the radio low, flipping through the cookbook stack for a recipe. I pulled out the wrong book, the one hiding my contributor copy, just as he walked in. "What's that?" I kept my hand steady. "Recipe." He came closer. "Let me see." I felt my throat tighten, but I forced myself to hand him the book. He flipped it open, and the magazine slid out, landing on the counter with a slap. He picked it up, his brow furrowing at the unfamiliar title. "Foundations Quarterly?" He flipped through it slowly, his eyes scanning until they stopped on the page. My page. "Designs by ML. He looked up at me. "This you..." I wanted to say no. I wanted to laugh and shake my head, but I didn't. "Yes." His mouth tightened. "When did you start submitting things?" "A while ago. And you didn't think to tell me? It didn't seem like something I needed permission for." That was the wrong thing to say. His eyes cooled the way a pond goes still before a storm. "Everything in this house involves me. Or have you forgotten that?" I didn't answer. Silence has a weight. I let it hang. He set the magazine down on the counter, too gently, as if restraint cost him. "I don't like secrets," he said, and left the kitchen. That night he was quieter than usual, but the quiet had teeth. I could feel them even as I washed the dishes, even as we went to bed. The next morning, my sewing cabinet wouldn't open. The key was missing. "Where's the key?" I asked when I found him in the garage. He didn't look up from tightening a bolt on the workbench. "Somewhere safe." I stood there, gripping the door frame. "It's my cabinet." He finally met my eyes. "Nothing in this house is just yours, Maria." It was then I knew the lock wasn't about the cabinet. It was about the line I'd crossed. My secret garden had been spotted, and Daniel had decided to build a fence around it. But what he didn't understand was that the seeds were already out in the world. I'd sent them. They'd grown. And now, even if he burned the garden to the ground, he couldn't unplant them. Still, I needed to be smart. He'd be watching me more closely now. Any move I made would have to serve two purposes: keep him calm and keep my roots alive. That's when I made my first deliberate misdirection. I started leaving harmless secrets for him to find. A short story from a library printout in my handbag. A list of gift ideas tucked in the pantry. He found them, of course, and each time he thought he'd uncovered the extent of my hidden life, the pressure eased just slightly. And in that breathing space, I began to plan something bigger. Something that wouldn't just protect my dreams, but make them untouchable. Because Daniel thought the fight was over. It wasn't. It was only moving to a field he didn't even know existed. Control is a funny thing. People like Daniel believe it's a fortress. High walls, locked gates, guards on every corner. They forget that you don't have to scale the walls if you can dig tunnels underneath. That's what I started doing. I stopped arguing about the cabinet key. Let him think he'd won. I even stopped sketching for a while, at least where he could possibly notice. Instead, I worked on something quieter, building a world outside his that could sustain me when I finally stepped out for good. It started with Helen. I wrote her a short, careful letter. no return address from the house, just the P.O. box I rented in the next town over. I thanked her for publishing my work and told her I'd be interested in submitting more. I didn't explain my situation. I didn't need pity. I just wanted a professional reason to keep in contact. She wrote back within a week. She had a few small commissions, nothing that paid much, but enough to get my name, or rather my initials, into circulation. I said yes to everything. Daniel thought my extra errands were grocery runs, trips to the post office for stamps, afternoons volunteering at the school. In reality, I was mailing sketches, picking up payments in cash, meeting with Helen twice in discreet coffee shops miles away from our neighborhood. The money went into a bank account Daniel didn't know existed. It wasn't much, but like seeds, small things grow if you feed them steadily. Then came an unexpected opportunity. Helen mentioned an upcoming design competition, open to anyone, judged anonymously. The winning concept would be built in a public park in the city. It was the kind of thing I used to dream about when I was 19, staring out of classroom windows. And for the first time in decades, I decided to enter. I worked in stolen moments, early mornings before Daniel woke, afternoons when he was on the golf course, late nights in the laundry room with the dryer running to cover the scratch of my pencil. I didn't tell Helen my real name, just my initials. The deadline was in 6 weeks. Around week 3, Daniel started sniffing around again. He'd ask strange questions. What have you been up to? Or, you seem tired lately. But in that tone that wasn't really curiosity, more like testing the perimeter. So I gave him something to find. I left an old sketch in my purse, something from years ago, rough and unimportant. When he accidentally discovered it while looking for gum, I acted flustered, defensive, like it was my only hidden thing. He seemed satisfied, almost smug, as though he'd caught me out and closed the loop again. Meanwhile, the real work was hidden in the false bottom of a laundry detergent box in the garage. Daniel hated doing laundry. I could have kept the crown jewels there. The night before the submission deadline, I drove to the city under the pretense of visiting a friend. I dropped my design package into the after-hours submission slot, the manila envelope sliding into the dark with a finality that made my hands tremble. Then I waited. The call came a month later. I was one of 3 finalists. The organizers wanted to meet each of us in person before making the final decision. The meeting was set for a Thursday morning in the city. Daniel would be at work. I didn't tell him, but life has a way of testing your nerve right when you think you've got the plan sealed tight. The night before the meeting, Daniel announced he'd be working from home the next day. Less distraction, he said. My stomach went cold, but I didn't flinch. That's nice, I told him. I spent the night thinking through every possible route, every excuse, every way I could still make it to that meeting without raising suspicion. By morning, I had won. At 9 a.m., I told Daniel I needed to pick up a specialty ingredient for dinner, something the local store didn't carry. He barely looked up from his laptop when I left. By 10, I was in the city, sitting across from the panel, my design spread out before them. I walked them through every line, every curve, every intention. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't falter. When it was over, they thanked me politely. I didn't know if I'd won. But I did know this: whatever the outcome, I'd been in that room as my truest self, and Daniel had no idea. That was the first real taste of revenge, not in hurting him, but in living a part of my life so far beyond his reach that it might as well have been another continent. 2 weeks later, I got the call. I'd won. The official announcement came in the local paper. It was a short piece, 3 finalists, 1 winner, a small photo of the proposed structure. My structure. They printed it without my name, just the initials ML, exactly as I'd requested. But anonymity isn't a perfect shield. People notice things, a certain style, a familiar curve in the design, and they talk. Helen called me that morning. "Congratulations," she said warmly. "The city will be contacting you to begin the build process. You'll have to attend a few public meetings, but they can credit the work however you like." I told her I'd think about the details. In truth, I was already thinking about Daniel, because while he might not read Foundation's quarterly, he did read the local news. The paper arrived at the house just after breakfast. I was loading the dishwasher when I heard him in the living room, the slow rustle of turning pages, then silence. "Maria." I dried my hands on a towel and walked in. He was holding the paper, his finger tapping the image of my design. "This looks familiar," he said. I kept my face neutral. "Does it?" His eyes narrowed. "ML, that's you." I didn't answer. He lowered the paper. "You've been doing this behind my back." "Yes." The word hung in the air like smoke. I half expected him to explode, but instead he just stared at me, the way you might look at a stranger who stepped into your home uninvited. Finally, he folded the paper and set it aside. "We'll talk about this tonight." But we didn't, not directly. That evening, he was all surface. Polite questions about dinner, a comment about the weather. It was worse than shouting. It meant he was recalculating. Over the next week, I could feel the shift. He started showing up unannounced when I was out. He accidentally went through my handbag. He asked pointed questions about errands, about the people I spoke to at the store, about why I was dressing up more often. But here's what he didn't know. The announcement had already triggered the final phase of my plan. Winning the competition meant I had leverage, not just in the sense of money or recognition, but in visibility. My work would be public now, tied to a timeline, connected to city officials, contractors, sponsors. That meant I had meetings to attend, decisions to make, things that could not be convincingly monitored without making him look controlling to the wrong people. And Daniel cared deeply about appearances. I started keeping a detailed paper trail of every project-related expense and conversation, not in the sewing cabinet this time, but in a file at Helen's office. If Daniel ever tried to cut me off or interfere, I could show those records to people who mattered in his professional circles. The irony was, I never planned to use it against him. I just needed him to know, even if only subconsciously, that he was no longer the sole gatekeeper of my world. Meanwhile, My secret bank account swelled. Payments from the city for consultation hours, small stipends for travel. Enough that I could move tomorrow if I wanted. And for the first time, I let myself imagine what that move would look like. Not a frantic escape with a duffel bag, but a deliberate departure. Keys left on the counter, closets empty, no need for goodbyes. Then came the first public meeting for the park project. It was held in a bright, echoing municipal hall. Helen was there, the city planner, a few council members, and about 20 residents. My design stood on a poster board at the front, the lines of the glass and stone exactly as I'd drawn them. When Helen introduced me, the designer of our winning concept, I stepped forward, my hands steady, my voice clear. And halfway through my presentation, I saw him, Daniel, standing at the back of the room. He didn't interrupt. He didn't scowl. He just watched. I finished the presentation, answered questions, accepted polite applause. And when the meeting broke up, he was gone. At home that night, he said nothing about it. Not the design, not the meeting, not my being on a first-name basis with city officials. But his silence wasn't victory, not for him. It was retreat. Because for the first time in our marriage, he'd seen me in a place he couldn't touch. He didn't know it yet, but that was the beginning of the end. After the public meeting, Daniel's presence in my days began to feel faded. Not gone. He still lived in the house, still moved through rooms like a shadow you can't quite catch, but smaller. I realized something. The more visible my work became, the less space he took up in my mind. It wasn't that he stopped trying. He still tested the boundaries. A casual question about where I was going. A comment about too much time spent on this park thing. But each time, I answered without hesitation. I didn't soften my voice. I didn't justify. And I didn't ask for permission. That was new. By midsummer, the foundation for the park structure was being poured. I was on site twice a week, wearing a hard hat, standing next to contractors, making decisions about stone texture and glass tint. People deferred to me in a way Daniel never had, and Daniel knew it. The first time he showed up at the park, I was bent over a blueprint with the lead builder. He waited until I finished speaking, then approached with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thought I'd see what all the fuss was about," he said. I handed him a pair of safety glasses. "Stay behind the cones if you want to watch." Then I turned back to the builder and kept talking. It was subtle, but it was the first time I'd given him an instruction instead of the other way around. He didn't argue, not there, not in front of witnesses. A week later, he asked if I'd be home for dinner. I told him I wouldn't. There was no excuse offered, no schedule explained, just a fact. I watched the words land, the way he opened his mouth and then closed it again. He was learning in real time that I no longer lived inside the walls he'd built for me. The day the structure was completed, the city held a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Helen stood beside me, the mayor on my other side. Cameras clicked, Children ran across the grass. Sunlight caught on the glass panels exactly the way I'd imagined years ago in the quiet of my kitchen. Daniel didn't come. I hadn't invited him. That night, I placed the event program, my name printed in full this time, not just initials, into a new notebook, a red one, thick, with pages I intended to fill, not with a ledger of what was taken from me, but with proof of what I'd built myself. The next morning, I moved out. No fight, no warning. I left the keys on the kitchen table, a single box of my belongings in the car. The rest I didn't want. I didn't leave a note. I didn't need to. The empty space would tell him everything. My new apartment was small, just 2 rooms and a balcony barely big enough for a chair. But from that chair, I could see the park. My park. The glass glinting in the sun was a constant reminder. They can take your dreams from your hands, but not from your heart. Not if you plant them deep enough. Daniel never called, not once. And that, I think, was his final attempt at control. The idea that my life should feel incomplete without his voice in it. It didn't, because now every choice is mine. Every morning I wake up and decide what to wear, where to go, what to draw. The walls are gone. The air is my own. Revenge, I've learned, doesn't have to be loud or cruel. Sometimes it's simply living in a way that proves the person who tried to break you failed completely. They took my dreams. I planted new ones in secret, and now they've grown too tall for anyone to cut down.